You're listening to the Unwritable Rant podcast with your host and bourbon-soaked storyteller, Juliette Miranda.
Hey there, y'all. It's Juliette Miranda, and this is episode 251 of the Unwritable Rant podcast. My bourbon-soaked story for you today is about relationship barnacles and camping without a trace. But first, I'm knocking back some bourbon. Cheers, y'all. Oh, that bourbon. So goddamn good. And you know who has really good bourbon selections? You're going to be blown away by this. Disney World. It's true. They do. They have fantastic bars in Disney World. And I can say this because my guy and I actually just got back from a little trip to Walt Disney World to celebrate my birthday. It was definitely a different experience being there right now, but we still had a total blast. Obviously, we got to visit our favorite Disney bars and restaurants, and because the crowds are considerably lower than normal, we could pretty much walk on all of our favorite rides. We did, however, have a slight incident at the hotel involving our bed, or more specifically, what's left of it. I don't know if it was the weight of all that Disney food we were carrying around, or, well, more likely, the kind of aggressive sex we were having, but we managed to break our goddamn bed. Oh, y'all, it was crazy. We were carrying on, as we do, and in the height of the action, there was this dramatic cracking sound. And it was so intrusive that my guy and I just freeze like a couple of naughty teenagers. And the next thing you know, we go sliding off of our once level mattress just right towards the floor. That was a first, and it wasn't a call to the front desk that either of us were excited to make. Fortunately, Disney was remarkably gracious about the whole thing. So while my guy and I had fun, I do have to say that I was kind of struck by the vast number of couples who did not seem like they were having any fun at all. Like, there was this one couple down the hall from us. Every time we walked past their door, they were embroiled in some sort of screaming match. And we couldn't help but stop and listen, especially when we heard the guy yelling, "Will you ask annoying questions, Leslie?" And then there was this other couple. They were having a meltdown outside of Disney's Hollywood studios. Apparently, the chick was annoyed because her dude wanted to spend more time in Star Wars land than she thought was acceptable. And this wasn't some quiet little discussion, and reason was definitely not involved in it, particularly when this girl screams that she didn't know she was marrying a Jedi loser. Oof. Disney had been the most magical place on Earth until these maniacs showed up. All of that relationship rage kind of got me thinking about how these people who clearly could not stand each other ever wound up together in the first place. Of course, the more I considered it, the more I realized how very close I came to winding up just like them. Like when I was dating this guy that I'll call Bugsy. He was another of my non-musician dating experiments. A perfectly fine guy who worked in advertising. We met through a mutual friend who thought both of us being creative types would make for a good match. And it did, at least in that we both knew how to read. And that is precisely where our similarities ended. Our complete incompatibility was apparent from the very first date, which was a last-minute Valentine's Day dinner at a fondue restaurant where I did all the eating. I was pretty much soaking everything but my napkin in that vat of molten cheese when I realized that Bugsy had only nibbled on a couple of raw carrots. He was looking everywhere but at the cheese, which really seemed weird, so I had to ask if something was wrong. Yeah, y'all, the guy was lactose intolerant. Like violently so. And the sight of those long threads of cheese extending from the fork to my mouth, it was triggering his gag reflexes so much, he was afraid to eat anything. Had I learned this little nugget in any other circumstance, like say over cocktails or coffee or something non-milk related, it would have been an instant deal breaker. Cheese is a very important part of my life. Come on. But the fondue place had been my idea. And quite honestly, I felt a little mortified about the whole thing. I mean, sure, Bugsy could have suggested a different place. I just figured between his first date jitters and maybe wanting to make a good impression, he decided to tough it out for me. I don't want anyone to feel like a date with me is some sort of endurance test, so I insisted that we leave before dessert and suggested we try the whole date thing again the next night. I really should have known better. And how many times have I said that? Because I gotta say, although our next and subsequent dates did get better, I can't say they were ever all that great. There was always a concession involved. He'd want to go bike riding, and I'd rather be drinking. Or I'd be into going to a concert, and he'd want to attend an art gallery opening. I think the only thing we were ever really able to synchronize was our sex. Still, he was a nice guy. It was never that I didn't like him. I just didn't like the same things as him. But did I have to? A lack of common interests just didn't seem like enough reason to break up with the guy. I was kind of conflicted, so I turned to the one resource a girl in her 20s should never, ever, ever utilize. I asked my mom for her advice. Going to my mother for advice is not something I routinely did, mostly because she relied far more heavily on emotions than I was comfortable. Logic and cold hard snark were my preferred judgment tools, but somehow they just didn't seem like enough to figure this one out. Not surprisingly, my mother thought I was being too picky. But she wasn't exactly objective. I had brought Bugsy along to my aunt's wedding not too long before, and while my dad and I got hammered at the bar, my mother formed an alliance with him. A couple of targeted and wildly inappropriate questions revealed that Bugsy's life goals, those being 2 kids and a house in the suburbs, well, they kind of matched my mother's own life goals for me. Not that either of them cared, but I was harboring escapist fantasies of dropping everything and moving to Playa del Carmen, where I could comb beaches by day and write all night. The only children in my future would be the ones I'd yell at to get off my sand. And when I told this to my mother, she used the one irrefutable argument she had in her arsenal. She said, "Well, do what you want, dear. Clearly, it's worked so well for you in the past." God damn it. What the hell was I supposed to say to that? I knew full fucking well I'd made a mess of my romantic life. And I had to admit, it was getting tiresome. Maybe my mother was right. Maybe if I kept an open mind, I'd find myself warming up more to Bugsy, and hell, maybe I'd even gain some new interests. So I stuck with him. I did. From February to June, he and I continued to date. And it was just enough time to settle into tedious resignation. Friends would ask me how things were going with Bugsy, and the only thing I could really say was, fine. Like I said, I didn't hate him. I just accepted him as a sort of relationship barnacle, one that I couldn't muster enough will to scrape off. Oh, and God, did he ever get itchy. Our differences became resentments. And suddenly, something as simple as him choosing a movie I didn't like, well, that would make him a dick. And it went both ways. He hated my favorite writers. And every time he'd see me thumbing through Hemingway or Bukowski, he'd get that obnoxious cheese sick face and ask me why I had fondness for such crap. I knew things had deteriorated past the point of okay when I found myself spite-eating a hunk of cheddar in front of him. That was horrible of me, too. I mean, I sat there gnawing on that thing and just licking my fingers. Oh, it was so gross and horrible. So that happens, and I know something needs to change. Bugsy and I just had very different ideas about what that would be. Over dinner one night, he announces that he's thinking about planning a weekend getaway for us. And he's all, "Come on, we could use the change of scenery." He was right about that, so I asked what he had in mind. When Bugsy told me he wanted it to be a surprise, a dead chill just rips through my core. Normally I'm fine with surprises and I have no problem going with the flow. But I didn't trust Bugsy to know what I would enjoy, so I gave him a little bit of help. I said, "Fine, I'll go, just as long as we're not going camping. You know I hate spending time in nature." This was not an exaggeration. I have never, ever made any secret of the fact that the only thing I dislike as much as children is nature. And I hate them both for the same reasons. They're dirty, unreasonable, and exceedingly exhausting. I spelled this out as plainly as I could, and he heard me. I know he did. But did Bugsy take my feelings into consideration when he planned this little getaway? Of course not. He shows up at my place Friday morning with 2 backpacks, a tent, and the stench of optimism. And I'm just staring at him when he announces our plans, and I'm going, no way am I going into the goddamn woods. His response is just to whine, and he's all, "Please give it a try. You might like it." No, I wouldn't. I knew I wouldn't. But fucking Bugsy, he looks so earnest. And he'd gone to all the trouble to plan this thing and to pack for us, so because I'm clearly an idiot who lacked any sort of spine, I caved. It was just 2 nights. I figured I could handle that. And maybe I could have, if I had been with a guy who camped like a normal person. You know, in actual campgrounds with a cooler full of booze. But oh no, that was not Bugsy. He was a true wilderness guy who wanted to commune with nature. And he's outlining this whole plan to me on the drive up to Starved Rock. We were going to hike through the sandstone canyons and then up to a secluded bluff where we'd set up our camp. We'd watch for fucking birds and seek out some stupid waterfall, and oh, it would just be so romantic. I highly doubted that, especially after he started using words like biodegradable toilet paper. But because I am a decent human being, I kept my mouth shut and just quietly fondled the flask of whiskey I'd tucked into my pocket. My outlook did not improve after reaching the parking lot. There, Bugsy straps an enormous backpack to me and announces that this is a leave-no-trace kind of camping trip, meaning we were going to be taking extra care to not make any direct impact on the wilderness around us. What about the impact on me? Come on, Bugsy. I should have backed out right then and there. It would have been so easy to just get in the car and leave. Because walking single file through the woods is not my idea of fun. But that's what I found myself doing. Just trudging along behind Bugsy, gear bouncing up and down on my back, and hoping that one of us, I really didn't care who, would get eaten by a bear. 3 hours and half a flask of whiskey later, we find ourselves on Bugsy's bluff, staring out at an expanse of water and trees, and I suppose it was pretty enough. I was just in too much pain to give a shit. You see, years ago, ballet ruined my feet. It is the biggest grudge that I hold against my mother, who kept me dancing far longer than I ever wanted. She said it would make me graceful. Yeah. It's hard to be graceful now when you're permanently missing chunks of toenail and your bunions have forced all of your toes to migrate sideways. It no longer matters what I do to protect my feet. Any amount of walking beyond casual strolls causes blisters. So I sit on the nearest stump and I pry off one of my shoes to reveal a sock saturated in blood. It looked as though I'd been walking on broken glass. There is literally a flap of skin hanging off the ball of my foot. And Bugsy has the fucking gall to yell at me to watch where I bleed. He's all, "What's wrong with you? Do you want every animal in the woods to track you down tonight?" Well, that was an interesting choice of words. You. He says you, track you down, not us. Which kind of makes me think he believes I blistered my feet deliberately to ruin his fun. No, if I wanted to ruin his fun, I'd hide my bloody socks in his sleeping bag. Instead, I seal them and a pile of bandage wrappers in some industrial-strength garbage bag Bugsy produces. Apparently, part of being a mindful camper is packing up everything you bring in. There are no trash cans in the woods, Bugsy explains. And you know what else the woods lack? Toilets. Somehow this detail escaped me. I think I just assumed that a state park would also have state toilets, or outhouses, or some sort of enclosed area where a gal can pee without a gang of raccoons watching. He must have seen my panicked expression because Bugsy laughs, and then he produces what he feels is a completely reasonable alternative. He says, "I knew you'd probably feel a little inconvenienced by the lack of bathrooms, so I brought you this." He brings me what is essentially a folding laundry rack with a toilet seat attached to it. I'm supposed to take this contraption 200 feet away from our campsite and dig what he calls a cat hole under it. A cat hole, I learn, is a euphemism for what is essentially a pit for dirt turds, which then needs to be covered with more dirt and debris to keep critters and campers from stumbling across it. And I'm lucky this trip because apparently Bugsy normally prefers to pack out his poop. But he thought that might be a little much for me to handle on my first trip, which I suppose just gave me something to look forward to. I try my best to look grateful as I accept my own personal shitter and watch as Bugsy assembles our tent. In my world, shelter is supposed to come with more than a zipper to protect you from invaders. A chipmunk could chew its way through this nylon atrocity if it was determined enough. And yet I'm supposed to smile and call this goddamn thing home for the next 2 nights. Ugh, I really should have brought along more bourbon. That afternoon and evening were filled with simmering tension. Bugsy was annoyed because I didn't want to do more hiking, and I was annoyed because everything. We ultimately fell asleep at 9 just so we wouldn't have to talk to each other anymore. I woke up a few hours later, still annoyed and fighting a desperate urge to pee. I didn't know what time it was, other than pitch black, and I really didn't want to have to leave the tent. Bugsy was dead asleep and snoring next to me, completely oblivious to the hard slab of dirt below us. And as I'm watching him just laying there snoring, I start fantasizing about punching him, just right against the side of his nose. And I could see it all playing out in my head, and it's just so glorious. It would be the swiftest breakup ever. Although I did suppose it would ultimately leave me stranded in the woods and likely later under arrest. Well, that ruled out slugging him. I was just going to have to break up with a guy like a normal person once this hellish trip was over. I knew it was the right thing to do. I mean, at this point, the only thing our relationship was going to do was implode. So for a moment, I felt relieved to have made a decision that didn't come with a codicil. But it did not solve my immediate and more pressing problem, which was deciding whether or not to pee. Sunrise was hours away, far too long to lay there holding it. Much as I hated the thought, I was just going to have to brave the woods alone. I unzipped the tent flap and grabbed a small flashlight that we'd brought in with us. It didn't do a whole lot to illuminate the campsite or ease the cloak of dread that settled over me. God only knew what the hell was out there in the woods, watching, waiting for some dummy like me to drop her ass over the wrong shrub. The metal frame of that stupid fucking folding toilet just gleamed in the beam of my flashlight. But I can't bring myself to grab it. It bore too close a resemblance of something you'd give a toddler. I've peed in enough fields at enough festivals to know how to manage this without training wheels, thank you very much. But as for walking 70 steps away from our campsite and digging a hole in the ground, fuck that. I walked to the back of the tent, dropped trowel, and got to business as quick as I could. And it wasn't so terrible, I guess. But as I was straightening myself out, something made its presence known. The noise was a cross between an angry hiss and a rustle, and it sounded way too close. It could have been anything. A raccoon, a snake, maybe the aliens from Fire in the Sky. I don't know. What I did know was that I did not want to stick around to find out. In my panic, I dropped the flashlight, and rather than fish around on the ground for it, I take off. What I forgot was just how close to the campsite I was. I just ran, and instead of running to the tent, I ran smack into it. Oh, what a mess. We all go down. Me, the flimsy nylon, the rods holding it up, all just right down onto Bugsy, who got the world's worst wake up. He starts flailing and screaming, and the more we struggle to get upright, the more damage we do. I've got this poor fool pinned to the ground in an elaborate wrestling hold. It's a wonder he could find the air to yell. I mean, what with the tent materials smothering his face and all. Eventually, I am able to peel Bugsy out. And once he gets his wits about him, the name-calling starts. He's all, "What kind of idiot are you?" And I'm all, "Well, I'm the kind of idiot who didn't want to go camping in the first place, fucknuts." Oof. Our nasty tirade gets so heated and so loud that it's enough to quiet the woods around us. And when I realize that we have actually scared coyotes away, I have to stop. And I just say, "Dude, this isn't working." Bugsy is surprised, and he asks, "What do you mean?" I sit down on the remains of the tent, and I say, "Us. This. All of it. It's over." Bugsy digs around in his backpack and produces 2 more flashlights. They're the good LED kind, and large swatches of light flood the area when he switches them on. He sits down next to me, and I expect him to agree with me. Maybe even suggest that we leave as soon as it's light out. Instead, Bugsy begins to argue, insisting that I haven't given him a chance. And I'm like, "Dude, I've done nothing but give you and us every chance." I motion to the area around us. "This isn't me," I say, "it's you. And I don't work with you." Bugsy stands up and starts pacing, and he's calling me selfish and stuck up and a bitch. And then he stops and he asks, "Well, what am I supposed to do now, huh? I can't just take the ring back." Whoa, slow down there, cowboy. The ring? What ring? Y'all, Bugsy was going to propose that weekend. He had the ring hidden away in his backpack and had planned on presenting it to me the next day at that waterfall he wanted to find. I can hear my mother's voice echoing in the back of my head as I think about this, and she's saying, "Just look at the ring. Maybe try it on. See how it feels." And I'll tell you, it was tempting. Because I wanted to be married. I wanted a relationship and love that would take me through life. Why else was I subjecting myself to all of these fucking jackasses if not to find someone I could love? But Bugsy? I wasn't even sure he liked me. He just had some role he wanted filled and was willing to squeeze me in regardless of how badly I fit. Yeah, that wasn't going to work for me. We sat on that ruined tent in chilly silence until the sun came up. It was easily the longest night of my life. I figured that would be the last I'd ever see of Bugsy. But a few weeks later, I bumped into him at Chicago's Jazz Fest. He was in line ahead of me at a food booth, and because I really didn't have any hard feelings toward him, I tap him on the shoulder to say hello. He kind of jumps when he realizes who I am, and then this slow blush creeps over his cheeks, because standing next to him is a girl he introduces as his fiancé. I had to hand it to him. 5 weeks to find a fiancé was some fast work. She smiles and shakes my hand, and as we exchange a few polite words, I couldn't help but notice that pretty little diamond shining on her left hand and wondering if maybe it had once been intended for me. Not that it matters. All I can say is that I hope for their sake that ring would be a better fit on her. Cheers, y'all. Thank you so much for listening to this episode of the Unwritable Rant Podcast. Be sure to join me Monday night on YouTube at 7 p.m. Central Time. It's where I host a little show called Bourbon-Soaked Live. It's kind of a free-for-all conversation where people gather in the chat and we hang out, drink bourbon, and talk about what's going on in our lives. You can also find every back episode of this podcast on my website, theunwritablерant.com. There's also a couple of icons at the top of the page. One which will take you to a store where you can buy merch, and another which will take you to a place where you can buy me a drink. It's a one-time donation to the show. You keep me in booze, and I'll keep you in boozy stories. So y'all, it is Mardi Gras weekend here in New Orleans, and that means I am going to go out with my guy and find something crazy to do. So y'all, laissez-les bon temps rouler, also known as cheers, y'all.
Go to theunwritablerant.com and sign up to get early access to interviews and new videos. And don't forget to connect with Juliette on Twitter at Morning Neurosis.
Girl, you as pretty as a Sunday morning, standing on the corner at Carondelet. What you say we make our way up to Bourbon, couple hurricanes and a hand grenade, and get blown away. Let the chips fall where they may. If it's all the same, what you say, bon ton relay. Hey, pretty mama, I can smell the gumbo. Sweetest taste of honeysuckle on my lips. Good God Almighty, I can hear the trombone. Every heart ought to beat to a rhythm like this. Come a little closer, honey, let me hold you. Nothing